Welcome, Gunrunner.
Although I release a documentary style video at least once a month, it struck me the other day that I hadn't looked at any unreleased systems for a long time now. I think the last one I did was the Texas Instruments console, and thought it was about time I returned to the subject. And while I was thinking about this, I thought about my own childhood growing up with a Sinclair ZX Spectrum and the long running rumours about a so-called Super Spectrum that never actually arrived. The closest thing we got to this dream machine was the Sam Coupe, which was unfortunately far too late to the market to make any real difference. From there I started thinking about some of the other machines that Sir Clive Sinclair's company rumoured in the press with no final result, and before long I had 5 such examples I could cover. More than enough for a video like this, and one that would nicely complement the similar videos I've already done on unreleased Atari 8-bit computers, and of course those of Sinclair's great rival in the UK, Commodore. And this is a really nice selection of different machines too, that covers almost every area of computing, giving us plenty to get our teeth into. So without further ado, let's get into the storytelling itself with 5 unreleased Sinclair computers.
You are about to witness Sir Clive Sinclair's quantum leap. He's come up with a computer to rival these machines at a fraction of their cost. The Sinclair QL system, with a massive 128K memory, color monitor and 4 professional software packages, £698. Phone 200 0200 for your nearest stockist.
Initially announced in 1981 as an answer to the BBC Micro, the ZX83, as it was originally codenamed, was conceived as Sinclair's high-end productivity computer, pitched at the complete opposite end of the market to the best-selling ZX Spectrum. Those who have watched the amazing BBC film The Micro Men will know all the background to this, with Sir Clive still smarting over losing out on the UK schools' computer literacy project. The BBC clearly didn't see the Spectrum as a serious computer, which is why they went with the Acorn design instead, and so Sinclair's engineers were quickly tasked with developing something similar, only better in every regard. The QL, which stands for Quantum Leap, was to be one of the very first 16-bit computers, with its Motorola 68008 CPU and 128K of RAM, which was pretty huge for the time. Unlike the Spectrum, it would also have a proper keyboard, although it did eventually share this with the Spectrum Plus model, and featured built-in data storage thanks to its twin microdrives. The original design also included a modem and a built-in monitor, utilising Sinclair's revolutionary flat-screen technology. More on that later, but these features were soon dropped in favour of a more simplified desktop design. A catalogue of disasters, mostly down to delays in the design of its ULA and operating system, saw it pushed back several times, and by the time of its official January 12th launch date in 1984, there was still no working prototype, and Sir Clive had a lot of questions to answer, as his company was still taking pre-orders despite being totally unable to deliver. This saw Sinclair Research being fined by the UK Advertising Standards Authority for false marketing. When computers did finally start to ship some 6 months later, they were riddled with problems, from broken microdrives and faulty chips to being completely dead right out of the box. Many people had to return their computers to Sinclair to be fixed, and the reception to the QL in the press of the time was lukewarm at best. And it was those so-called revolutionary microdrives that caused the biggest issue. These tiny tape-like cartridges were supposed to be a much cheaper alternative to discs, and the expensive drives required to read them, but were soon found to be very unreliable as they were wiped far too easily, were prone to magnetic interference, and the internal tape would also start to stretch, making them unable to read. Although fixes were eventually made to correct these problems, especially with the latest Samsung produced drives, the damage was already done, and those who did own a QL started looking for other solutions, such as third-party produced disk drives. but Sinclair didn't completely bury their heads in the sand, as they were hurriedly developing a new version of the QL that used a completely different storage medium. Now you might be thinking that this was some sort of disk drive instead, which would seem logical, but Sinclair, being Sinclair, wanted something new and revolutionary. This would be called a wafer drive, and was not unlike a modern SSD hard drive in many ways, as instead of individual RAM chips or a large magnetic disk, this contained an entire silicon wafer, with multiple chip dies, meaning any imperfections in the wafer would cause the dies covering them to fail, so the driver was intelligent enough to automatically route around any failed units. This was seen as foolproof, the complete reverse of those dreaded micro drives. Sinclair developed several versions of this, a small add-on for existing QL users that was slotted in the side of the computer, a larger external drive, and a new model of the QL itself with the new wafer drive, totally replacing the old micro drives. Also known as the QL Plus and the Janus, its codename, Sinclair's chief designer Rick Dickinson mocked up several different designs for the wafer, and they really do look amazing, like something from the future. And it's a shame this machine never made it out the door. Now I'll get onto why in a minute, so you'll have to bear with me until the end of the next entry, as they're very closely related. So you might have already guessed by my ending to the last segment, but this next computer is very closely related to the QL wafer, but is very much its own thing, especially given how it developed, and so very much deserves its own segment in this video. Now, I already mentioned that a QL with a built-in disk drive or two would have been the easiest solution to the microdrive issue, so it probably won't come as much of a surprise to learn that this was something Sinclair very much considered. In fact, it went a bit further than that, as they set about developing a disk-based QL as a backup plan in case they couldn't get the wafer to function as they wanted. Dubbed the Enigma, this was just an idea at first, but then Sinclair saw the success of the PCW from rivals Amstrad, a cheap all-in-one computer designed specifically for office-based tasks like spreadsheets and word processing, and decided this new market presented an ideal opportunity to reimagine the Enigma idea. The plan to make it QL compatible was then abandoned, and the Enigma would now become a cheap PC compatible. Unlike the PCW, this computer would be fully compatible with the existing IBM standard, but Sinclair felt that they could come up with something much cheaper than all the existing PC clones on the market, and it would be much more competitive price-wise with the PCW. He figured that a full PC compatible would tempt people away from Amstrad and into the arms of Sinclair, and he was probably right. Unfortunately, the Enigma never got much further than a few rough mock-ups, and the development of the Enigma now seems rather ironic given what happened next. Because in April 1986, Sinclair made an agreement to sell his whole computer business to great rival Alan Sugar and his company Amstrad. And one of the first things the now Lord Sugar did was cancel all of Sinclair's engineering projects and close down their entire R&D department. Amstrad had a very different vision for the Sinclair brand that would just involve selling cheap all-in-one Spectrum computers to cash in on the already huge market for the 8-bit computer. This will become a running theme in this video, unfortunately. Okay, so this next entry isn't actually a computer. It is in fact a console, the only such device that Sinclair ever developed in fact. You might also be familiar with the Sinclair LC3 from a standalone video I did on it some years ago. So I won't go into massive amounts of detail here, and I'll link that original video down in the description for those who want to take a deep dive on the subject. So the year is 1983, and Sinclair Research Limited are riding high on the wave created by the ZX Spectrum, the very first colour home computer that could be purchased for under £100. They were also still selling plenty of its predecessor, the Sinclair ZX81-2, as a much cheaper budget-priced entry into home computing. Everyone was wondering where Sinclair would go next, and there were lots of whisperings about all sorts of products that were being developed in their labs in Cambridge. But perhaps the most interesting one of all was a project codenamed the LC3. Standing for Low Cost Colour Computer, the last part should probably be switched out for console, because this was in fact a new keyboardless system that was being designed to compete with the likes of the Atari 2600, ColecoVision and Mattel Intellivision that were making big waves on the other side of the pond. There was also the threat of similar machines from Japan, and Sir Clive was worried that these low-cost all-in-one game boxes would start to become successful in the UK too, eating into his market share, and figured he would try to beat them to the punch. Newly employed engineer Martin Brennan, who was just putting the finishing touches to the Interface 1, which allowed those aforementioned microdrives to connect to the Spectrum, had come up with an idea for a cost-reduced version of the Spectrum to replace the ZX81, and Clive liked what he heard. It was initially envisaged as a home computer, but after Martin spoke with Clive, it soon became obvious that the console was the way to go, one that could be later upgraded into a computer if the user wished. This would take the form of a small box with a microdrive slot, 8-colour character-based graphics, Z80 CPU and a sound generator. Martin proposed that this whole setup could be designed around just 2 chips, making it extremely cheap to produce. Once it became obvious that there were issues with the reliability of the microdrives, the design was changed to use ROM cartridges instead. After all, Sinclair had developed their own version of the format with the introduction of the Interface 2 for the Spectrum. According to Martin, the design was basically done by the end of the year, including the system BIOS, but Sinclair wanted to hold off on its release so they could get the QL out the door first. As we entered 1984, the LC3 project was put on hold again, and then completely cancelled as it became clear that consoles were no longer a threat. Martin Brennan has stated in interviews that the LC3 was basically done, and he was gutted that it was never released, and he might be surprised to learn that in hindsight, Sir Clive himself agrees with this view, as when he was interviewed in 1986 after he had just sold his computer division to Amstrad, he stated, "I still think the LC3 was the best approach for Sinclair. It was a complete colour computer entirely on 2 chips, very much like the Japanese Nintendo machine, but many years beforehand." It certainly presents a very intriguing what-if story in the history of the UK games industry. Of all the unreleased Sinclair projects, this one is the one that intrigues me the most, as the Pandora was an attempt to create a laptop version of the Sinclair ZX Spectrum years before laptops had even become a thing. If you look back at the so-called portable computers of the early 80s, you'll find things like the Osborne 1 and Commodore SX64, computers that barely met that criteria and certainly couldn't be considered laptops by any stretch of the imagination. The Pandora would have been something very different. Its origins actually go back all the way to 1981, when Sir Clive Sinclair was developing his first portable TVs. Remember, Sinclair Research were actually the very first company to develop such a device. He dreamed of creating a computer that could be combined with this technology to be truly portable, and set about designing such a device. He codenamed this Pandora, and decided to base it around his new ZX Spectrum computer, which was just about to be released. The first stumbling block he hit was the data storage issue, and development on the Pandora was paused while he contemplated this, but that was eventually resolved by the creation of the Sinclair microdrive, which I've already talked about in great deal of course. The second issue was creating a screen big enough for such a device, and this was eventually solved by implementing a series of mirrors that would project the image into a curved screen, a bit like CinemaScope. The NTEX AdventureVision handheld used a somewhat similar system. However, as clear as all this was, Sinclair was struggling to get it working properly, finding that only some types of text and colour would work, with green on black seeming to work best. Sinclair were confident enough in the Pandora's development that they commissioned chief designer Rick Dickinson to mock up some images for the computer to use in the press of the era. These started to be shown in early 1986 and gave people hope that the Pandora was nearing completion, but Sinclair was still struggling to get it working as they wanted. A former Sinclair software engineer who was developing the operating system for the Pandora said that it was a bit like looking at one of those magic pictures, with your eyes constantly struggling to focus on what was actually there. It was still going through various revisions and redesigns that were taking it further and further away from its ZX Spectrum roots, right up until the time that Amstrad agreed to buy out Sinclair in April 1986. Many hoped that Pandora would survive the takeover, but when journalist Guy Cuney asked Alan Sugar if he'd acquired the rights to Pandora, Lord Sugar replied, "Have you seen it?" "Yes," said Guy. "Well then," said Sugar, and that seemed to be the end of the matter. Interestingly, Sir Clive would come back to the idea of a portable computer when he released the Cambridge Computer Z88 in 1988, but that was a totally different design with a small LCD screen, more like a palm-top device than an actual laptop like the Pandora, so perhaps, like Alan, he knew that the Pandora was a dud too. Now, if you mention the very subject of unreleased Sinclair computers to the most hardcore fans of the company, they will mention the Loki, perhaps the most mysterious and mythical computer of them all. Now, you might remember me talking about the long-running rumour of a so-called super spectrum in the intro. And that's exactly what the Loki was, a true next-generation Sinclair computer capable of competing with the likes of the Amiga and Atari ST. You might also recall me mentioning a young chap named Martin Brennan in my segment about the LC3, and he plays a very important part in this particular part of the story too, as he, along with fellow Sinclair engineers John Matheson and Ben Cheese, had formed a small group within Sinclair tasked with creating the next generation of the ZX Spectrum. I'm sure that at least a few of you out there will recognise these names, and you should do, because they're all very important figures in video game history, but I'll come back to that in due course. It was 1985 and Sinclair had just teamed up with Spanish partners Investronica to release the Spectrum 128, a new version of the best-selling computer that not only featured 128K of RAM, but also a new menu-driven OS and a 3-channel sound chip. But this machine was very much seen as a stopgap. It wasn't anywhere near the upgrade that people hoped for, and the internal Sinclair team knew it. And that's what led to the development of the Loki. An early design proposal sets out exactly what the Loki was going to be, and that is a full-on replacement for the ZX Spectrum that would retail for under £200 and would be very much designed with games in mind. There are boasts of a synthesizer sound chip, cartoon quality graphics, and almost endless expansion capabilities. Indeed, this latter claim was also focused on for its more computer-like capabilities, with the promise of MIDI ports, a CD and Laserdisc interface, and Genlock video operations. Sinclair User Magazine even claimed to have the full specs for the Loki, which they took great pleasure in publishing to the excitement of their readers. But this was all just words, sadly, as despite all the hype, the Loki never really came to much according to the team behind it. Both Brennan and Matheson have stated that the Loki never got beyond the initial design phase and no chips were ever finalised, let alone prototyped. However, our old friend Rick Dickinson did start sketching out some ideas of what it could look like. As you probably guessed, it was the Amstrad takeover that put an end to the Loki, with all the team behind its development given the sack by Lord Sugar. Now, you might be thinking that this was the end of the Loki, but it actually wasn't, and those who recognise the names of Brennan, Matheson and Cheese might know why, because after leaving Sinclair, these guys teamed up with another friend in Richard Miller to form Flare Technology, where the Loki became the Flare 1. This was then shown off to potential partners who could help Flare bring it to market, and it was eventually picked up by well-known joystick manufacturers Konix, where it was renamed the Multistem. Now, you probably know that this machine never made it out the door either, and I simply don't have the time to go into that story in this video, but it's definitely one worth looking up if you don't know it. However, I will mention that it was third time lucky for Flare, when their next machine, the Flare 2, was picked up by Atari and became the Jaguar. So a kind of happy ending of sorts, I suppose.
In the search for the definitive computer simulator game, one name is clearly emerging. KX Multistem. Experience the reality. Get behind the wheel of the new KX Multistem and you'll really appreciate that powerful 32-bit custom processor. This is real state-of-the-art graphic performance, and even at these speeds, it handles beautifully.
And this is really a display of a lifetime, perfect control over every maneuver, and with over 4,000 different colors to choose from, we're looking at a dazzling graphic display. Well, have you ever seen anything quite like this? What a powerful machine this is. We're getting the ultimate high performance from its 16-bit microprocessor. And just listen to that. That CD quality sound from the KX Multistem. Unbeatable.
Seeing and hearing the KX Multistem is one thing. Feeling it is another. The control unit gives full tactile feedback, so you can feel the tarmac as you drive. Feel the wings respond as you pull back on the controls. Sense the bite of the tyres as you corner hard into that sharp left-hander. The KX Multistem. It's a car, it's a plane, it's a bike in one system. Not only that, but there's a gear shift mounted on the right of the control unit. And unique dual foot pedals that are really responsive for maximum realism. For other combat games, there are fire buttons placed in just the right position. We even include a free KX Navigator joystick with every multi-system. And all games are on standard 3.5-inch disc drive for real cost effectiveness. But the KX Multistem doesn't stop there. If you think the multi-system itself is amazing, the accessories are out of this world. Take your seat for the experience of a lifetime. This is the KX Multistem powered chair. It rolls, pitches and yaws just like the real thing. You can't get more realism without actually being there. The TV is mounted on the chair too, so it moves as you move. There's a seat belt for full security and a wide base and low centre of gravity for maximum stability. There are styling panels with stereo speakers you can add for CD quality with extra vroom. And for the ultimate in realism, enter your own private world with the optional full-size cover. Added to that, there's a helicopter control stick you can plug in for greater game flexibility. A 12-button keyboard, giving instant control for even the most complex games. And a space-age style light gun for instant on-screen play. It's got real recoil action as you fire. A clip-on hand grip and butt to turn it into a rifle. And it's even got an auto-fire control to get you out of the tightest spots. It all adds up to a world-beating system with software to match. Like the multi-system itself, the software for it is quite literally the best on Earth. The world's top software manufacturers have been commissioned to write software specifically for the KX Multistem. And we'll be adding as many as 10 new ones a month. The KX Multistem. Experience the reality today.
And that runs on my look at 5 unreleased Sinclair computers. Were you looking forward to the release of any of these back in the day, and which ones do you think had the best chance of success? Or do you think they were right to bin them all? I always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comment section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons and YouTube backers for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following people in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Paul Daniel, Mins, Dos Gamerman, Luke MC, Carl Olsen, Seth Robinson, Frosty, Mark Strickland, Kalimatorn, Trogdor the Burninator, Daniel Skoronsky, Ben P. Stein, Tabby Kitsune, David Maddox, Your Eyes Are Bleeding, Joe Casara, Classic Gamer 74, Bernard Santu, Peter Grantham, Noah Man and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now, where you can get access to extra content including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.